Floating houses. Let's talk about them. Hi, how are you? Floating houses is a joke or a silly thought that I said on Instagram like a year or 2 years ago. And it has stuck with me in my thoughts ever since then. Whenever I think of a silly thought, I always go back to floating houses because it's so absurd and so interesting that today I would like to explore the idea of floating houses even further and just really think about the logistics of this absurd idea. So floating houses, floating apartment buildings, you can live in a floating house or floating apartment building. You know, maybe this is what our future holds. I don't know. But I think the importance of thinking about silly things like this is, first of all, if you think about something that is completely not normal, you step away from the normal and into the absurd, and it broadens your mind of new possibilities, and you start to question things. And then you realize, oh, that's why we do it this way, is because if we did it another way, it would be ridiculous. And so sometimes that ridiculous is good, and sometimes that ridiculous just is not the proper or the best way to do things. But it's good to step outside of the normal and question things, and then you come back to the normal and you may appreciate it more. And so instead of thinking about normal houses and normal apartment buildings, let's think about them floating in the air. And I have some thoughts about this, and I've made some notes. Because I've really given this some thought. So floating, let's say you have a floating house. The big question is it stationary, where it just stays in one place, or is it a free-floating home and it just floats randomly around the world? And there's different issues with both of those scenarios. One, also, the issue is how high, the altitude. So should the house be, 800 feet off the ground? Should it be 1,000? It probably shouldn't be like 32,000 feet because that's where planes fly. And I don't know what the future altitudes will be. But I'm thinking about, maybe 3,000 feet in the air. Because you get into all these other things of, we'll get to it. Like, is it an eyesore in the sky? Do people want to look at floating houses and things like that? Is it tethered? Is there a line? Is there a rope to keep it in place? Is there some kind of, rod holding the house in place? Is there an elevator to go up into it? And would you want the house to be just floating? And I suppose there's the possibility of you could have your house or apartment building in one place, in a lot. And then the option is sometimes you can float it above the ground, or you can keep it on the ground, or you can have a floating house. It depends. Maybe every Wednesday you float your house up, or maybe you float your house up for special occasions, like, you want to see the fireworks better on the 4th of July or New Year's Eve. But, that way you keep your address. Because, you've got your lot, and then you've got your house that floats up in the air, and then you have a fixed address, as opposed to having a free-flowing house, which can just go anywhere. What's your address? I don't know. How does mail get to you? How do deliveries get to you? Because your address changes. Like every second, your address changes. You're literally going with the wind if you have a free-floating home. And I'm thinking, if you do have a free-floating home, you could have, your house lot that you can come back to, kind of like a landing pad, like a base. And that can be your address, but you can also float around like you're on a cruise ship. Apartment buildings or houses could be like floating cruise ships. So you're just going along, and every morning you wake up to a different place. See, if you have a free-floating home, these ideas are just going to be random, really random, and maybe one day I'll put them in an organized fashion, but let's just do it randomly today. So you got a free-floating home, and you wake up, and you got to go to work. Well, every day, your commute to work would be a different distance, right? So these are some of the logistics you got to think about when you have a free floating home. So you wake up, you get ready, you're ready to go to work. How do you get to work? Do you have a jetpack? Do you have a flying car? I think this would be a really good time to invent portals. So you could just open a portal and go right to work. Or maybe you work from home. Oh, I don't know. But that's one of the issues you're going to have to deal with is, if you're in a different place, imagine waking up to a different location every single day. Maybe you'd enjoy that. I don't know. Or you could just do it for a little while. You could do it on a year voyage or 6 months or something like that, and then come back and be stationary for the other half of the year. Some people in North America, they hang out in North America during the summer, and then they head to other parts of the world where it's summer when North America is in winter, and they just experience summer all the time. Maybe you could do that with a free floating home. Half of the year you're stationary and half of the year you're floating around. I don't know. These are some of the things I've thought about. So you'd have to invent the technology, right? You'd have to invent levitation or anti-gravity technology to allow a floating home. So let's say we have the technology to do that. You'd probably also need thrusters on your floating home in case you want to just not free float everywhere, but, actually steer the direction and where you want your home to go. Let's say you want your home to travel from here to there or a certain part of the world. You can set the navigation on the home computer, and your thrusters or your steering wheel, your navigation can steer you in the right direction. It's all automated in your floating home, so you could float to a destination. I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't written that down. So yeah, you could float to a destination. It could be random, or you could have, a goal that you go to. Also, you have to worry about, or one of the concerns is, well, there's several concerns. One is you don't want to fall off, right? And you certainly don't want, the dog playing in the yard to fetch the Frisbee and go off. So you'd have a safety bubble around the home to prevent any falling, and you can't fall out because of the safety bubble. So everything and everybody is safe inside the bubble of the home. Now, the other function of the bubble is that what if two floating homes collide, right? But if they both have bubbles, they just kind of lightly bounce off one another. So imagine you got two helium balloons and they're just floating around, and they kind of just lightly touch and then bounce off and just move around. It's kind of like bubbles. Let's demonstrate. It's like bubbles. They just kind of bump into each other and just kind of lightly bounce off. Imagine these are all just floating homes, except they would stay in the air. I'm bringing props into this now. But it's kind of like that. You got your safety bubble. They just kind of bounce off and they float around, and it's really delightful that you got your safety so no one falls, and you got your safety so if things bump into each other, it's totally cool. It's very casual. Some of the benefits of having a floating home, if you're in a band, you can play as loud as you want and you're not going to disturb the neighbors. So if you play the drums, the neighbors aren't going to complain because they can't hear you. Because your neighbors are, drifting over there, right? Salespeople probably won't knock on your door because, you're off the ground. You're away from everything. That's pretty great. The air is fresher up there. You've got great views, You can see the stars better because there's no light pollution because you're way up there. You can see the ground and you can see, all around in a 360 thing, right? You could have like a little thing on top of your house where you could look all the way around, 360 view, right? And maybe it's better psychologically to just, be light. Your house is light and your life is light. You're just floating around, and, you're closer to the sun. So I'm one of those people who really need sunlight all the time to really, lighten up my day. So you'd have, the sunlight. You could fly above the clouds if you wanted to. Now, there's probably some, restrictions. There might have to have some floating house laws, some aviation laws or altitude laws to there's a certain level, there's a certain height you don't want to go, you shouldn't go, and you can program your house to not go too high or too low. Because if you go too low, people might consider it an eyesore. It's like your shadow of your house is blocking their view or distracting them, or your house is blocking the sun or the moon or the stars for some people. And so I can see how that might be an issue. So there might be an altitude that your floating home pretty much has to stay at. Now, the other issue you're going to run into is there's 8 billion people on the planet. No, not all of those people might have a floating home or live in a floating apartment building. But that means a lot of people could be in the air. A lot of people could have floating homes. And does that clutter the sky? There's a lot of things to think about this. I mean, this is one silly thought that if you just keep going with it, you get into all these details that just are fascinating to think about. It also makes you appreciate houses and apartment buildings that are fixed on the ground, not causing all these problems. But, imagine billions of houses, millions or billions of houses and buildings floating through the air. Is that good? Is that bad? There is, since I have unlimited technology here in Fantasyland, we have the technology that allows your house to float in the air. We have the technology of the safety bubble around it. And then we have the technology of, what was I talking about? Oh, yes. Eyesores. So invisibility. What if you take the Harry Potter invisibility cloak thing and you put it around the house and you make the house invisible, and then nobody has to see the house? It's kind of like what they do in the Avengers. They flew up in that big ship in the air, and then they, turned on the invisibility thing. So everybody can see the sky just fine, and nobody can see your house because it's invisible. So we've solved that problem. Although there's another issue, if friends want to visit your house, instead of saying, come on over, you'd have to say, come on up. And they'd say, well, where are you at? Well, currently I'm floating over the Pacific Ocean. Okay, give me your coordinates. And, they step through their portal and they enter your floating home for, a dinner party or something like that. Or you're on the ground, you go to a restaurant or something like that, okay? And when you're done with the restaurant, it's time to go home, but your home has floated 20 miles away. So how are you going to get home? So you can hire a car service to take you to your floating home. You have a flying car of your own. You have jetpacks. You have your portal. You have some way to get to your floating home. But that's another thing to think about. What if you're hanging out on the ground and you got to get home? I really think the portal thing is a great idea. There are also there's some upsides, there's some downsides. There might be a loss of community. In a neighborhood or an apartment building, you're part of a community. It's interesting because once you think about this, you start bringing up all these things. It's like, who am I? What's our identity? And your identity is not only who you are, but where you are. Where you are sort of designates part of your identity of, well, I'm so-and-so and I live somewhere. When you first meet someone, what's your name? Where are you from? Well, it reminds me of in the movie Up, when George Clooney's character is constantly on airplanes flying around. And one of the passengers asks, the plane captain asks George Clooney's character, so where are you from? And he's on the plane and he says, here. So his home was on the plane. So maybe your home is everywhere. I don't know. That's interesting. So, okay, jetpacks, elevators, flying cars, deliveries. Okay. If you want delivery from the grocery store, I suppose you have to pick which grocery store, or maybe automatically the computer decides which grocery store is closest to your house, wherever your house is floating, and delivers it to you. Homeowners associations, there might be some issues. Zoning laws, utilities, gas, electric, water. How's that going to get to your house? So, well, you could have solar power panels hooked to the roof, and that can provide all the electricity for your home. Then maybe you don't need gas. Then water, maybe, think about clouds. How do clouds get water? Well, the water vapor floats up. I can't remember what that process is called, but the water vapor... Water vapor floats up into the clouds and makes water, and then it rains down, right? Well, why can't you use that same cloud technology for your home? You just take the water vapor that's floating up into the air, and you just collect it and use that water and use it in your home. You purify it or whatever, and you just use it in your home. So there you've got water. Okay, so we've solved that. You got solar and you got water vapor. There's your utilities. Waste disposal, I suppose, is something to think about. You don't want to be dropping your waste disposals just, willy-nilly on the ground. So you'd have to come up with something for that. And I'm probably not going to go into that detail. Trick-or-treating might be an issue. How are you going to do that? You can have the trick-or-treaters jetpacks? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe you have to be in a neighborhood for that. You can just fly from floating house to floating house. Christmas might be interesting because then you'd have Christmas lights, but that would be very pretty. To see a bunch of floating homes with Christmas lights on them, floating through the sky, that might be really cool at night. Imagine that. Floating houses with Christmas lights floating in the beautiful nighttime dusk sky. And that'd be awesome. That'd be beautiful. Weather issues. Okay, they got your magic bubble. So the weather, you also got your thrusters on your home. So that controls, so if there's a wind and storm that blows your home around, the safety bubble and the thrusters will protect you from the storm and the lightning and the wind and the rain. And so you've got that. So we've got that covered. And emergency thrusters, in case something goes wrong, you start to lose altitude, or you start drifting in the wrong direction, and you'd probably have to have regular repairs and inspections for repairs regularly, because, you don't want to lose anti-gravity levitation. And I just wonder if there's a technology that just makes your home light, so light that it just floats up. I don't know. What's that movie, Up, where he ties enough balloons to his home or his health? And he just floats around. Maybe this is all just a continuation of the movie Up without the balloons. Issues that might come up. So you've got who can afford a floating home? Are they free? Are they low cost? Are they only for the ultra rich? There might be some jealousy there. Oh, those darn rich people are floating in their houses, blocking the sun for us people down here. There might be issues with that. So I'm thinking in a perfect world, floating homes cost just as much as regular homes, or maybe just a little bit more, but they're not expensive. And I think that would keep down the resentment and the jealousy and deal with that in a perfect world. But since we're in our fantasy world, let's go with that. That the floating homes are very low cost. That would keep maybe some issues off the table. And also, okay, you might have to have homeowners insurance for floating homes. Landscaping companies might have to adjust traveling to your home to mow your lawn. Or maybe you could have just your robots do it. Sure. Drone deliveries, right? They'd have to find where you are. The benefits, environment, there'd be more farmland if everybody had, or several people had floating houses, and there'd be more land and less issues with the environment and using land. So the invisibility cloak, the address, feeling part of a community. You can always go back to your home plot or your landing pad and be part of that community. But you can always, you can also just float away. You can have the best of both worlds, maybe. I don't, where you designate it, I suppose wherever your landing pad of your house is. And, these are just some of the issues that I thought would be fun to think about with floating houses. And the floating houses don't have to look like houses. They could be round. They could be all kinds of shaped. You could have, your house shaped like a guitar, You could have your floating house, your floating apartment building, be all kinds of different shapes. So there's that. So maybe in the future we'll have floating homes. Does this sound interesting to you? So I'm curious, would you want a floating home? Would you want to live in a floating apartment building like it's a cruise ship? Is this an interesting idea? Would you like me to, explore more silly ideas like this? Would it make you appreciate normalness? Would it make you appreciate, a stationary home? And would it make you appreciate the emptiness of our skies? I'll tell you right now, here in the year 2026, eventually there's going to be drone deliveries constantly in the sky. I'm expecting this. And I don't know if it'll ever happen, but who knows? We'll have drone deliveries. You'll see drones in the sky flying around your groceries and stuff like that, and your orders, and bringing food to your house. And I'm appreciating the empty skies now in our present time because it might be different. And it's good to think about, what could be in order to appreciate now and what we have now. But also, just open your mind to new possibilities. Anyway, is this an interesting topic? And I would love to know your thoughts about this. Would you enjoy living in a floating home? Do you think floating homes would be a good idea? Or would it just bring up all kinds of issues that should not be brought up? Anyway, I would love to know your opinion about this, about floating houses and floating apartment buildings and floating the life living in the sky, like Cloud City in Empire Strikes Back. Anyway, what are your thoughts on this? I would love to know. And I want you to have a wonderful week thinking about silly thoughts. Have a fantastic February.